I understand.
Welcome to BSRM Presents Straight Talk. This is Dhaka Tribune editor Zafar Sobhan, and today I'm in conversation with Mark Nosworthy, who is the CEO of Bproperty, which is a real estate solutions provider. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Zafar.
And I'll get straight to it. A real estate solutions provider. Tell me a little bit more about that. What kind of solutions is it that you guys provide?
Yeah, sure. So if I give you a bit of an understanding of some of the challenges that we saw when we looked at Bangladesh a couple of years ago.
Sure.
Bangladesh, when it comes to real estate, is very traditional in the way in which it deals with it. You know, it's left to everyone to try and find their own solution.
Right.
Whether that's coming or finding their own property, whether that's determining what the right price is, whether that's navigating the legal challenges within the industry. And everyone was obviously just doing it themselves.
Yeah.
And what that caused was a lot of misuse of the industry.
Okay.
A lot of instances where people were potentially, defrauded out of particular
a lot of
transactions,
inefficiency,
and there were some inefficiencies. Correct.
Yeah.
And so as a result, what we looked at was actually trying to create a vehicle that aided consumers and the country to provide those efficiencies when it comes to dealing with real estate. And so we looked at everything from providing access to choice. How do you understand all of the options that are available in the market? Whether that's developers, whether that's homes that are available to move into today, without having to, in effect, door knock yourself. That's one thing. How do you determine what is the right price to pay? How do you know that actually the legal documents that you're looking at are legitimate?
Okay, so you provide all of those services.
We provide all of those solutions, really.
I mean, I think for me the interesting thing is talking about the price, and it is something that's occurred to me because over years of living in Dhaka and renting, is the truth of the matter is it's really hard to say. You don't really know what the market is. You go to someone and you say, okay, I would like to rent this apartment from you. They'll quote you a price. You have no real way of saying, well, is that a good price? Is that a good deal? Is that a poor deal? And so some people are overpaying, some people are underpaying. So that's what you're trying to fix, is it?
Yeah, that's one of the things, for sure. Yeah. So ultimately, we want to create an industry where it's fair for everyone. I think everyone actually has or doesn't have an issue with paying what is the market price.
Right.
I think obviously there are a lot of instances where people would, as you said, overpay, underpay. And it's about just trying to create an efficient, fair system for everyone that allows for confidence in the industry. Yeah. Because when people don't have confidence in something, whether that's real estate, it could be schooling, it could be education, it could be things like, a home, it could be anything. When people don't have confidence, they tend to refrain from interacting with that environment, right? Because of purely, a nervousness and a lack of understanding of what they need to do. And so everything that we do, whether it's access to choice, access to pricing, market intelligence, legal, access to legal support, providing the documentation, is all about building confidence that allows you as a seller or a tenant or a landlord or a developer operating within real estate with confidence. Yeah. And I'm a big believer that if you can give confidence to something or someone, that's going to allow them to interact more with that particular event or industry, so which then aids everyone. Yes. And for me, then it's really a future-looking business that's trying to look at, okay, how does this country develop? Yeah. Real estate is typically a big driver of any developing economy.
I think that's it. I mean, I think the reason, if you want to say, okay, well, how has it sort of turned out that way? I mean, I think it's fairly common, I would imagine, is that when a country is just starting to develop, these drivers are not particularly well formed.
Yeah, exactly.
And as Bangladesh moves in, we want to be a middle-income country fairly soon. We need to move things to a much more sophisticated, much more professional footing.
Correct.
And that's where you guys come in.
Correct.
How have you found, since you've moved to Bangladesh, the response? Have you found that developers are actually keen to work with you? Have you found that there's a real market for what you're selling and people are like, this is great, we really needed this, and we're really glad that you guys are here?
Yeah, I think the response we've found is been exceptional. Yeah. And in some respects, I think the response is actually too much for us.
Yeah. That's good news, right?
It is good news. Obviously then the challenge is it becomes an operational challenge for us. Yeah. But if I were to look at, okay, we're 4 years into our journey here. We've grown 3 to 4x, year on year. The response, we deal with about 80,000 inquiries a month for real estate solutions. That could be from developers, that could be from individuals, and that's a heck of a lot of consumers that need support. Our challenge, my challenge as a CEO, is actually how do you mobilize a business to provide a solution to 80,000 people?
Yeah.
Which is not as straightforward as being a product provider that I can create one product and it satisfies 80,000 people, because everyone has their own unique challenge.
That's right.
Right?
They have their different.
Correct. And so you're trying to then solve 80,000 problems at the same time, and that becomes the challenge for us. So from a response perspective, it's actually been very, very good, because that comes out of the recognition of that there is a big need for
that shows you there's an
the
incredible
country
demand, right?
in
People
order
want to know
to
this information.
provide this, or have access to a solution such as this. It's now about, okay, let's make sure we execute, and let's make sure we actually deliver on what individuals actually need as that solution.
Yeah, and do you feel that, like I said, 80,000, and this is how many of these like individual consumers, and it's people from all levels of the economic ladder who
Correct.
are,
Correct.
Yeah.
Like most are individuals. Obviously, because a developer could come to us and say, Mark, can you sell all 500 of my apartments? And obviously we just treat that as being one inquiry. So most of those are going to be just individuals that are either looking to buy, sell, rent, etc. Yeah. They could be looking for land, they could be looking for investment, businesses, there's a whole host of different scenarios. And that's when it becomes a challenge, dealing with those individuals.
And you haven't, and what you really have is you have data, you have information, and that's what you can share with people. That is what gives you that ability to provide that service. Have you found in the a couple of years you've been operating here, that already you've seen some rationalization of the market based on people coming to you and based on the data which is now out there, which didn't used to be there?
Sure. There is not as much variation
anymore,
in the pricing. I think that's driven from, one, obviously just market becoming a lot more mature than where it was, certainly 4 years ago when we started. But also I'd like to think that that's driven a lot from ourselves being a go-to company when it comes to a basis for understanding and looking at real estate. And we do spend a lot trying to normalize this. And I think we're getting better at that. Also, what I'd say is now we're about 2 years into actually having transaction data. And so that transaction data is obviously the fundamental, point at which valuations are done from. Whereas obviously everyone can come up with initially, I'd like to sell or I'd like to rent my property out for a particular price. Right. But the truth is really in the transaction data.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so now we have a couple of years of transaction data, which now gives us a very, very strong base when it comes to talking with anyone, whether that could be a developer, an individual consumer, individual seller, for example, when it comes to actually educating them about actually what is the right price for them.
Yeah, and I think this is something which is really valuable information, especially if you've got your middle class, lower middle class, let's say a young professional or someone like that, because they don't have a great deal of money. They really need to make sure that whatever money they're spending on their housing, they spend it in the most efficient way, and they find out which, what can you expect to get, let's say the 10,000 taka, 15,000, 20,000 taka range. People really actually need to know this, right?
Yeah, exactly right. How I look at it is I always like to put myself in the shoes of the other person, right? The consumer. And real estate is something that we all interact with, right? We all have to live somewhere. We either rent a property or we live in our property that we own. So real estate tends to be something that we all think about from time to time. And so it's very easy to put yourself in that particular person's shoes when it comes to, well, what challenges would I go through when it comes to understanding a particular thing. A lot of it comes down to price. I've got a certain budget that I want to pay. I have an expectation of what I think I need. Now it's a matter of putting in a solution that allows me to deal with the requirements that I have. And that's where, again, you want to have access to all of the market.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question, Mark. Is one of the things I noticed, just, it's not what I do for a living, but, I've observed this. It seems to me in Dhaka, there are just not enough small units. We still have this idea that everything should be 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom. Why is that? And, it seems to me I don't know, you would know better. Is there, I can't imagine there's not a demand, especially if you're if you're a single person, if you're a young married couple, no kids, and you have a limited budget. Why are these units not being built? I mean, I've lived overseas, and that is really pretty much the average pattern we see in a city in the US, Canada, UK. Why not here?
Correct. I agree fundamentally. I think it's a big challenge, which I think is just driven from a couple of main factors. One is Bangladesh still has a very traditional way of developing products. I also think, secondly, building a new project does typically have a 5 to 7 year time frame. It obviously starts from acquiring the land, then you design the product, then you obviously go for approvals, and then you've got the build phase. That could be anywhere from 5 to 7 years, and possibly some projects could be, could even take longer. In the last decade, I think what we've all seen is such a radical change in how the social how society has developed in Bangladesh. And for me, you've got now a much more affluent middle class than something that we've never had before. They've got now access to a level of disposable income that they've never had access to before. I think now with the openness to the West and with social media and the like, I think that's now changing the way in which families are now based. So typically now you're not seeing 3-4 generations living in the same property. You might see 2.
So the market is basically just lagging behind
100%.
societal
Yeah,
change.
absolutely. Because the society is changing so very quick.
Okay. Mark, hold that thought. I'm going to take a commercial break. We'll come back and we'll discuss this a little bit more after the break. Thank you. Okay. And please join us after the break. This is Zafar Sobhan presenting Straight Talk. Thank you.
I understand.
Welcome back to BSRM Presents Straight Talk. This is Zafar Sobhan in conversation with Mark Nosworthy. Mark, so before we went to the break, we were talking a little bit about the market, right? So let's talk a little bit about the efficiency in the building market and how that could, we could make changes there and maybe make things better for consumers.
Sure. I do think that the whole industry is inefficient, right? And I'm not saying that's a necessarily bad thing. That's just the reality of where we are, and obviously the things that need to be changed moving forwards. Inefficiency means waste. Waste means money, right? It's a very, very
money
simple
out of
equation.
my pocket, money out of everyone's pocket.
And that's not just real estate. That's any business. Any individual. If we can improve the efficiency of a project or of a development, for example, for me that does mean lower costs. Secondly, I think coming back to what we were talking about before the break around properties that are being priced at a particular different level, etc., and is this in reach of a middle class or a lower middle class, for example? I do think that there are solutions that can be put together which aid where the social or where society is today. Then also looking at how do we then get access to the middle class into real estate. Everyone fundamentally wants to own a property. Everyone fundamentally wants to buy because that gives them security.
Let me ask you a question. What about going even further down the ladder? Is there a solution out there for low-income people?
Sure.
And where would where are the opportunities there?
I do think so. I think when you get down to low-income people, I think one of the challenges also becomes how do they access enough cash.
Sure.
But certainly designing and developing product that allows for them to attain something.
Everyone needs a decent standard of living. You got all these people coming into Dhaka. Everyone, maybe they won't be owning the property, but everyone deserves the ability to have certain services, a certain level of a certain standard of living at an affordable price, which I think is not necessarily the case. I mean, I've heard statistics saying if you look at the slums in Dhaka and you actually see what people are paying, it's comparable to the highest real estate prices in the city, which is that's really unacceptable. So is that something you think we can make a dent in? Because I think that would be really important.
We can make a dent. There is definitely the demand there. That are people that are looking for.
I mean, they're paying the money.
Correct, they are.
I mean, they need to get something in return, right?
I was with the banks a couple of weeks ago, and actually, if you look at now, people are paying typically on average about 25,000-30,000 rent per month. That's a typical average rent in most parts of Dhaka.
And that's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money. If you were to then put that and say, okay, how much mortgage or what home loan would that give me? You're looking at then a property value of around about 50 lakh.
Yeah.
The challenge then becomes, how do you then bridge the down payment that's required in order to attain yourself of that home loan? And this is where I was with the banks that said, guys, we need to put together a solution here that allows for this middle class because they can afford it. They're already paying it in rent.
Yeah,
they would rather pay that into their own property, even possibly, try and find
an extra couple thousand. We're talking about like a mortgage
thousand.
market,
Correct.
basically, yeah.
Even look to try and find an extra couple of thousand, Taka, even if they have to increase it, because now they're buying
building
their own asset.
They're building
capital
equity,
wealth, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And it comes back down to, one, can the banking sector provide solutions for that? That's one thing. Secondly, can developers in the real estate industry actually look to provide product at that level that allows for those consumers to enter it? I do think economically it can be done. If we put together efficient processes, if we look at building on time, and if we look at building the right type of product which eliminates waste in a project, that can actually be achieved. And we've done studies with developers. We've obviously looked at it ourselves.
And there's appetite among the banks. They're interested.
Well, the banks want to lend.
Yeah, of course.
So the banks want to lend, right? They want to increase their. A lot of the banks are now looking at, how do I increase my retail, division. Retail obviously is more and more consumers. From my point of view, and I'm not a banker, but from my point of view, if I were to look at banking risk, I would rather segregate my risk and lend to more people than have it concentrated on people that potentially might on paper be in a position to afford it, and I give them bigger loans. So I would rather increase the base of
it just sounds straight up good banking
and
to
give
me,
it but give a smaller amounts. That's where I would be. But obviously that's a transformation within the banking sector. And how does that banking sector then link up with real estate to then provide solutions that aids the middle class, the low middle class? Because in my opinion, they can't afford it. It just needs all these industries to work together such that we can provide solutions to consumers.
Sure. And now there's a conventional wisdom which I guess you would probably refute, which says that, right now we have a housing bubble, that there's a glut of housing and that housing is overpriced, and that it's probably going to come down at some point. But would you agree with that, or?
I wouldn't agree necessarily to it on the basis that people are still paying for it. So typically for me, price is driven from what's the market prepared to pay for it.
Right.
So if people are still buying property, and they still are at those prices, then obviously the market's pricing itself. I think we do see price pressure in some areas. We do see an increase in price in other areas, which are perhaps developing a lot quicker. Take Mirpur, for example. There is an increase in prices in Mirpur, Mohammadpur, purely that I would attribute to the metro rail and obviously improved access links, in that part of town. But there is negative price pressure in the likes of, say, Dunmondi and this Gulshan and kind of Bonani belt.
So that's very interesting. It's just a question of people, sort of realigning where they're living.
Absolutely right. So there'll always be opportunities, I think, to get capital growth.
What about outside of Dhaka?
So outside of Dhaka, at the moment, Bproperty, we're in Chittagong. So we've been in Chittagong now for about 2 years. We have, I think, about 60, 70 people down there. We're working with developers and consumers there. We also have people on the ground in Sylhet, Narangon, Comilla, Ghazipur. And then we're looking at opening up about another 6 or 7 cities this year. Cities for us is anyone where it's circa 500,000 people and above.
That's a big town in Bangladesh.
Yeah, it is. I say to some of the guys internally that Mirpur is the country's 3rd largest city. Just the actual concentration of people in that part of town. It really is the country's third largest city.
I'm a big believer that one of the things we need to do here in Bangladesh is, we need to start developing are outside cities.
Yeah.
First, the ones
Yeah.
in the immediate environs of Dhaka, but all over the country, and create metros there. And again, housing is a big part of that. If you have good, cheap housing, that's going to attract people, and then they'll stay and they'll say, okay, I'm going to try and create something here rather than move to Dhaka, which is a lot of that's happening right now.
Yeah,
but I don't think it's sustainable,
No, correct. It has to shift, right? I think putting more and more people into Dhaka with the infrastructure that exists today just can't be supported.
Right. It's
so you have to look at expanding either the city and also opening up other cities. Fundamentally, there is 30 million people or so in Dhaka. 5 million people in the country's second largest city.
Yeah.
Out of a country of 160 million people, when you've got the second largest city only having 5 million people in it, for me, there's a bit of a problem,
mismatch,
with regards to actually how people are, where they're living and where all the jobs and the economy is concentrated. And so we have to do a better job, in terms of shifting some of these centers away from Dhaka and opening up, some of these other regional centers. That is a job of real estate industry. That's a job of putting in more infrastructure in place to support jobs, to support people obviously just living in these cities. So it's a massive challenge. Don't get me wrong, but I do think we can't just keep building in Dhaka. We have to.
Well, of course, we're going outside of Dhaka, and are you working in places like Savar, Ghazipur, Purbanchal?
So we have a land project ourselves in Purbanchal.
Okay.
We are in Tongi. We are in Ghazipur. We are in Savar. We are in Naranganj. So we are looking at opening up those cities in a lot deeper context. And just expanding, the services, there. But obviously, it's just a matter of, working with the various stakeholders in those places to provide the support. But as I said, 80,000 consumers we deal with, every single day. That's consumers we actually speak to.
Yeah.
And everyone needs a solution. And so our problem isn't so much the demand, because I think there is a massive demand. It's a matter of, how does Bproperty actually execute on providing a solution to you as a consumer?
Yeah.
And it's a race that we're in, really.
Well, thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks.
This has been a great conversation. I wish we'd had more time, but we are out of time now.
Sure.
For me, it's been fascinating because, I've grew up in Dhaka and I've sort of seen the city develop around me, and I'm endlessly fascinated by, the twists and the turns, and I'm really interested to see what happens over the next 10, 20, 30 years as we really make that push to major international metropolis.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for your time.
Thanks.
And thank you. This has been BSRM Presents Straight Talk. This has been Zafar Sobhan in conversation with Mark Nosworthy. Thank you very much.
I understand.